Hello, hello, and welcome back to the IBS Freedom Podcast. OMG, I'm so excited for this episode. So, we all know and love Amy Hollencamp, RD2Max.
Hello.
Hooray, hooray for you. But really, the excitement here is that we have the man that needs no introduction in this space, but I'll introduce him anyway. We have Jason Haralek, and he's
Woo.
the brains behind probioticadvisor.com. Probably a lot of you have used his probiotic search tool. You've taken some of his courses. You've learned about the microbiome through him, I'm sure. But we have him to sit here and chat with us, and I've got some questions and things to mentally chew on. So welcome, Jason. We are so excited to have you on the podcast.
Yay.
Round of applause. Round of applause.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I always love talking gastrointestinal issues and IBS and SIBO and microbiome. So it's always a pleasure talking to other people who are passionate about those things too.
Did I not tell you, though? Today we're talking about hippos. You got the topic mixed up, dude.
Got the wrong person for that, I reckon.
That would be great if we could have a full-blown discussion about hippos. But nay, you're right. We're going to talk about the gut and the microbiome.
Yeah.
Well, let's start grilling him, Amy. What do we start with?
I think you had the questions. I think
I
you
was going
should
to say,
start.
do you have any to start us off with? I don't want to take up all the air.
No, you
this.
had some. You were chomping at the bit with some, so
Okay.
you start. I defer.
Can I tell you something first? Can I be an awkward person first? Okay. I have had a term for a long time, predates me knowing about you. I've had a term for a long time that I have affectionately called a science crush, meaning I don't have crush on the person, but if we could have lunch together, I would absolutely lose my mind. And you have been a science crush of mine for a while. So I'm just super thrilled that you're here. So just so you know, now you know the term science crush.
Science
Just
crush, I like it.
I want to talk to you. I want to pick your brain.
Yeah. I've got science
like it.
crushes too. It's
Okay, good. So it's not just
There we
me.
go.
Maybe you didn't have the term, but
no.
now you know the label to use.
Yeah.
Hashtag science crush.
I will. Yes, I will remember that label. It's good, actually.
Good. Well, let's start, if I may. Let's start with a topic that I think I kind of initially found your work through, which is stool testing. And just say somebody's at home, maybe they just got diagnosed with IBS, they're freaking out, they don't know what to do, their GI isn't giving them many answers, if any.
Yeah.
And they're thinking about doing a stool test, particularly a more functional type stool test. So, something that their functional doctor or naturopath could order, or something they would order at home. What kind of things might you tell somebody at home if they are considering doing one of these functional stool tests? What type? Do you think that one type is superior, one type of technology? Are there any big grains of salt that we should take when we're looking at data like this?
Oh, geez, big questions to start with.
Right out the gate. And I will say, I think conventional gastroenterology is still in the space of, no, they're imperfect and they're rubbish, never use them. Right? So if you took a microbiome test to a GI doctor, they would either roll their eyes or laugh at you, or just ignore it and not use it. And I remember I went to a conference a while back, a couple years ago, and they had a whole lecture about stool testing in clinical practice, and it was all ragging on functional medicine and how horrible these tests are and how unusable they are. I think that the truth probably is somewhere in the middle of the extremes of they're junk, never ever use them from the conventional side, and oh my God, these are perfect and infallible and amazing, and we can trust the results with 100% certainty from the functional side. I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. So, I don't know. With that, I will give you the mic.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly. I think the issue is it doesn't diagnose a specific disease. I think conventional gastros are we want a test that tells you what disease someone has, and these tests don't do that. So I think they would see that as a limitation. That's kind of the paradigm that they're within is this test equals this disease, and it's we're not having that. We're talking more about digestive functionality, microbiota, ecosystem composition, and I still am surprised at how few gastroenterologists are actually aware of the microbiome and its repercussions and how important it is. Even I started my PhD 22 years ago in this area, or 21 years ago, and people were talking about it then, how important it was in mainstream gastroenterology journals, and I'm still surprised that there's still many clinicians out there in the gastro world who still are fairly ignorant of the gut microbiota, why it's important, how to look at things, what it means. And I think it's sometimes a threatening test to bring in too, because it actually shows they're like, oh my God, I don't know what the hell Bacteroides is. I don't know what a Firmicutes is. I don't know what a Proteobacteria is. And they're like, it's useless. I don't know what it is. So, I wasn't taught it in my 15 years of training, or however many years they do. Therefore, it must be useless. So
like
I think there's a degree of that. There definitely is with some, and I think that can often be far too common among specialists. Clinicians, in my experience, is if it's not something they were taught about, then it mustn't be important. And we can kind of ignore its existence. But. I think I'm just trying to think of where the best place to start, but let's look at different technologies. Maybe that's a good place to start, where we've got the old technology, which is culturing. And culturing is where we kind of took a poo sample and we put it into some petri dishes and we kind of looked to see what would grow. And that was done from the late 1800s. That's where we first saw E. coli, bifidobacteria, and things like that in poo. So some bugs we've known about for a fair while from that time. And that technology evolved a little bit up to the late 1900s, but not hugely. It was still the same process of taking poo, putting it, and trying to grow it on stuff. But what they worked out in the 60s is if you put it in like a anaerobic chamber that took all the oxygen out, we could grow more bugs. And that kind of blew people's minds. They're like, oh my God, there's not less like 10 species in the gut. They're like, 60 species in the gut. Or, it was like a major leap forward. But what we have found in the last 20 years is that culturing is very limited, in that you can only see a small percentage of what's actually there. That's a huge issue if you're wanting to look at the gut ecosystem and you can't see what's there. The test is pretty useless. So I think any test that's using culturing to tell you what species are present in the gut is majorly problematic and immensely limited, and I would not recommend. Culturing will always have a place for how do we assess antimicrobial activity. So you can grow that Klebsiella and you can put some herbs or some antibiotics on it and see if it kills that specific one. So culturing will always have a bit of a role to play. It'll have a role with once we work out what a species is in a fecal, from a DNA sample, we can work out if we can grow it, what conditions it might need. We might learn more about that species from growing it. So I think culturing is not dead, but it's not useful to tell us what the ecosystem composition is.
Yeah. And I think I've seen numbers that estimated like 80% of the gut microbiota is not culturable currently. Something like that. Like it's a pretty
it's huge.
Fair whack.
Yeah, it's not like a 5% or something. It's like the vast majority of bugs that, and some of these haven't even been named yet either, for that matter, which is, another, I think some people would see as a broader limitation with using stool tests now, is that we're still, even the good ones that can tell us what's there with more accuracy, there's still most species we don't know what they do yet. And I do hear that too, but as someone who's been in this field for 20 some years, there's a lot of species we do know what they do, and we do know what roles they play, and we can change them, and that changes people's health. So I think it's still premature to go, because we don't know what a lot of them do. We should ignore this entire field. But so we've got culturing tests, which I think are very, very limited. And then we've got DNA-based tests, and within that broad group, I'd say there's kind of three different technologies that tend to be used, that people or clinicians have access to. We've got PCR tests, or quantified PCR, which it's accurate, generally considered to be fairly accurate at finding things. So if it looks for the DNA component for bifidobacteria, and it can kind of find that component. Generally, the biggest limitation, I'd say, with that technology, even when done well, is that it's generally only looking for certain things, and most of them, the ones that use PCR, what I would call pathogen deep dive tests, it's almost like their sole existence is to go, how many pathogens can we find? Let's look for as many pathogens as possible. And I think even that mindset is problematic, because it just means that you're kind of looking for what to kill. You're like, what can I kill in here? What can I kill? And every single patient is like, what can I kill? Rather than other tests that are using 16S rRNA or shotgun metabolic sequencing, when you look at the entirety of the ecosystem and you're looking at balance. So dysbiosis, and when you do those tests, is about how balanced is this ecosystem? What can we tweak? What can we change? How can we balance this? And you get quite a different perspective when you order those tests, in my opinion, than they're like, what can I kill in this particular patient? What specific one pathogen or two pathogens can I kill to make this person better? Because I think it's seldom about that. And yes, there are some people where there are things like Giardia or, salmonella or something where there is a specific thing that we need to target. But I think for a majority of people, and particularly people with irritable bowel syndrome, it's not generally that. It's generally a imbalanced ecosystem where even things like methane producing bacteria, it's not like we want to eliminate and exterminate them. We just want to lower their levels so they're not producing excess methane, which is a problem, because having no methane is also a problem, I would argue, but it's just having excess is problematic. So you get a different mindset. And I think the other advantage of 16S and shotgun sequencing is we see the entirety of there, and you get to see the balance. I used to find those the culturing ones where they go, "Oh, you've got 4+ Klebsiella." What the hell does that mean? Really,
right.
What does it mean? Because normal levels of Klebsiella are like 0.05%. Okay, so or less, and let's say you've got a 0.1%. That might show up as 4+. But I've had patients where 65% Klebsiella on a stool test. That'll show up as 4+. And are they different? Yeah, they're different. Do you treat them differently? Yeah. Do you have to worry about side effects and die-off reactions differently? Yeah. Like I'm actually quite shocked at the degree of die-off I've had from my patients who are like 60% Klebsiella when we use herbal antimicrobials. It's like the severity of die-off symptoms in that situation versus a 0.1% Klebsiella is quite different, and you would treat that differently. And you also get to know the context of what that's in. What's the total number of species present? What's the spread of those species? And that you only get from using 16S or shotgun. And for me, that's why they're my major favorites when we're wanting to look at the ecosystem, because I want to see the entirety, I want to see diversity, I want to see ecosystem richness, I want to see how things are compare. The proportion of different species I think is super, super important. Now, sometimes those tests often won't necessarily have the functional markers, though, like digestive markers and short-chain fatty acids and things like that. So sometimes if I want to know those things, you have to do 2 tests. That's kind of the limitation currently. It's like, okay, well, if I want to get the best idea of gut function, inflammatory markers, and microbiota composition at the moment, to me, that requires 2 different tests to do that. Yeah, because I think for some people, I do want to look at calprotectin, lactoferrin, short levels of fecal fat, malabsorption type things, pancreatic elastase, short-chain fatty acid ratios. So I think there are a time and place for those sort of more comprehensive stool analysis, stool pH, that I do find useful. But I'd say for the majority of my patients, I'm more interested in ecosystem composition. So I would use 16S and shotgun far more commonly in my practice without the additional CDSA type ones. And I think the other aspect with the CDSA or CSA ones is I kind of have to tell my patients we'll ignore the culture section, and because that culturing technique isn't particularly accurate at telling us what's there from ecosystem perspectives, and we'll rely on the other tests to tell us what's there from a microbiology perspective.
Well, and I always wonder too, like when I see those culture tests, because sometimes people will bring them into me and I take a look-see, but what if you had a normal amount of E. coli or Klebsiella, but you're growing this on a petri dish, presumably in an oxygen-rich environment, and what if it's just we're favoring the growth of oxygen-tolerant bacteria?
Yes.
So it's like maybe that's normal and to be expected that Klebsiella and E. coli are like blooming like crazy on virtually every CDSA and CSA test. Like maybe that's actually not atypical. I'd be kind of curious to see like 100 samples from healthy, normal people and see if they had like 4+ Klebsiella. I think that might just be...
I share that concern, totally. And the times where I've done like a split poo and sent that person's poo to a lab doing DNA technology and one we're using culturing, and then it's like, oh, look, it's 4+ Klebsiella, but that's a 0.001%. Bacteroides was 4+, and it was like 20%. It's like, well, is it 20? It was pretty useless. And I do I agree that what we might be just growing is we just have a medium that the bacteria really love, and that petri dish media may be something that powers them on like bionic growth factor, and you get this very exaggerated response and unrepresentative of what's actually there in the ecosystem. And what I like about the DNA-based ones is they're killing everything kind of once the poo's out, and we get this lovely representation of actual populations that are there in the gut.
Yeah, one thing too, and I want to like circle back and just, I love everything you're saying. I think that, you're really exemplifying that the gut microbiome is so complex. And I feel like there is this mentality with our clients, like you were harping on a little bit. It's like, oh, we just need to kill something. That's it. Like we just need to find that one it factor in the gut,
The boogeyman.
to kill. And it's like, no, that's probably, again, there are some boogeymen that you probably do want to kill. And ruling those out can be a good thing. But I think for the majority of people, if you're going into a stool test with the mentality of finding something to kill, it's probably not the best mentality to go into a stool test. It's probably a better mentality to think like, I want to see how, if there, what the proportionality and the complexity of my microbiome, and maybe I don't get all the answers from it, but you can gather some decent insights to help you move forward. But I think always just having a humbling mentality that like, okay, the microbiome is complex, and it's like we can't just target one thing without it affecting a bunch of other things. And I think the more we kind of oversimplify the microbiome, the more we can get into trouble.
Yeah, I'd agree with that too.
Well,
Yeah.
and there's so many problems with this world too. Like I've seen a lot of patients, and I think probably practitioners who like they look for the boogeyman, and when the boogeyman is
Right.
not there, like they get disappointed, oddly. And like I do get it on some level, but I think this will sound overly harsh, but I think there's some truth to it. It's easier to take a month of an antimicrobial and like fight a battle, do a strict diet. You just have to suffer through this 1 month, and then you're going to be cured, and everyone's going to be like farting rainbows with the unicorns and frolicking off into the sunset, versus talking to people about what we harp on in this podcast a lot, which is stress, sleep, mental health, nutrition. Are you eating enough? Are you getting vitamins and minerals and fiber and stuff? Are you actually eating vegetables? Like just the really basic, unglamorous, unsexy stuff. Like that takes so much more effort, and it's harder to really motivate yourself to make those changes for the rest of your life versus, oh, I could just take a magic pill for a month and then all my problems are magically solved. Like that's very tempting for both the patient and the practitioner, because then also, as the practitioner, if you identify a boogeyman and then you treat the boogeyman, like you kind of look like a hero. Like, da 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 da, I saved you from E. coli.
Right.
Oh my God. And like, it's not to say that being the hero is unappealing to me, but it's just, we've got to be careful with these like kind of common human brain lesions, shall we call them? Can I ask something else about stool testing while we're on this topic, by the way?
Yep.
I've noticed, and I'm sure you've read more articles than I have, I'm sure. So maybe I can get your perception on this. I've noticed when I read research about the microbiome, it feels like the vast majority is 16S testing.
Yep.
Like, I don't know if I could put a number to it, but like 80 or 90%
You're
of
right.
the articles
I would
I
concur.
see
Yeah.
is 16S. And then more and more, we're starting to see some whole genome, sequencing kind of stuff, but
Yes.
it's still not ultra common. Like that's definitely a lesser player. And then it's at the point where like, if I see somebody talking about the microbiome and it's based off of a PCR test or culture, it's weird almost.
Yeah.
Like I kind of like pause and almost like, was that an illusion? Oh yeah, it really is a PCR test that they're using. So why do you think that is?
You're
Do you
right.
think it's
Yeah.
do you think it's because 16S has been around longer? Do you think it's because it's cheap? Because like a 16S test, the commercially available ones are pretty cheap. They're like $100, $120 US. Do you think it's because it's been around for a while, because it's cheap? Or do you think that there's another reason that I'm just not familiar with because I've never done research?
I reckon it's partly because it's been around for a while, and partly because they're inexpensive to do relatively. Yeah, and whereas shotgun is newer, and the biggest issue is just cost. Like if we do research studies and it's like, okay, we can get a 16S test done from the lab for $100 a shot. You'd argue hopefully less, but let's say it's that. And then we contact a lab for using shotgun, and it's $350 or $400 per person per test. Like,
Yep.
oh. Yeah,
Good
big
enough.
pharmaceutical companies have got lots of money they can afford to pay for such things. But for other researchers, it's like that's huge. Like you're paying 4 or 5 times as much for will you get probably more accurate data down to like species and strain? Yes, and you can look at genetic pathways which are interesting and might learn more. I do like aspects of shotgun, but I think the reason why it's the cost differential is the biggest reason why we're using mostly 16S. And we get to see that entirety, because I think the issue with PCR is you can see what you want to see, but you don't get to see the entirety. And I think most researchers are wanting to look more broadly and to try to find things and look at, find new things that they may not have seen before, because but if you're only looking at, is bifidobacteria high or low in IBS patients, and that's all you'll see, versus what does the ecosystem look like in IBS patients.
Yeah.
But you're very much spot on. So I think even the disease associations we see, like dysbiotic patterns we see, are often much more at the genus level, because we've been using CCNS to really discover things a lot more. Will that change? Yeah, I reckon it will in another 20 years. We'll probably be looking at, rather than just Bacteroides and having overgrowth, too much Bacteroides, we'll be looking at, Bacteroides fragilis versus Bacteroides Satomicron, or whatever it might be, or vulgaris. And we won't even have the tools we have the research done to tell us how to deal with that. Because at the moment we're like, I know how to deal with, broader Bacteroides overgrowth, but do we have the tools to go, we want to leave Bacteroides vulgaris but treat Bacteroides fragilis? We don't know currently how to do that. Because that requires lots of investigation using shotgun sequencing. So, as 20 years from now, we'll have that kind of data. But at the moment, we're seeing much more genus level associations. And that's partly why I'm quite happy using that kind of data to help inform, see what my patients' ecosystems look like and how to move forward, because that's kind of the best research that we've got is based on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's almost some element of why bother getting more detailed, because we don't have the research to really inform us on our decision making anyway, even if we did have the more detailed information for that patient on some level. Maybe there's a time and a place for some detail, certainly.
That's
an interesting
agree.
point.
Sometimes I've got a colleague who specializes in infant microbiome, and for her, looking at the exact species of bifidobacteria that is present is immensely important, because there's enough research in that area looking at that we and even targeting interventions that you can actually work in that species level data more so.
Yeah, makes sense. Again, I don't want to take up all the airspace. I feel bad that Amy's sitting there quietly for so much of the podcast.
No, I'm thoroughly enjoying myself. I think again, another thing that's so interesting when you are just specifically kind of going after the bad guys is there's really not tons of discussion, I think, in the functional medicine space about the good guys. I think there's some, but it's majorly outweighed by the bad. Looking for the, Klebsiella or Pseudomonas or, some of these quote unquote opportunistic baddies. I don't know. I don't know if that's the best term, but I think that there's so much discussion of these bad guys that there's so much less focus on getting the good guys up and running again and supporting the good guys and trying to support growth of the good guys. And I find that it's a harder sell to patients too, because again, they just want to go, because all the focus is on the bad, so they want to go back to the bad guys. But yeah, I do find that too, just in this space, that there's just less focus on kind of growing the good guys. And I think, with some of the work that you've done with your own patients, how important supporting the good is in the whole context of the ecosystem. Does that almost become more important than pruning out the bad? I feel like I've kind of found that more so in my practice working with people is, really just trying to foster the good. There are times when you do have to prune a little bit and you might have to do some antimicrobials just to kind of help manipulate a little bit. But I do think, it's pretty amazing how much supporting the good can have a pretty great effect. But yeah.
Totally agree. And even just supporting the good can reduce levels of potential pathogens too.
Right.
I think that's a bit to me that is definitely not discussed as much at the functional medicine field as it should. Is like you use prebiotics and you can reduce levels of pathogenic bacteria pretty quickly and effectively without the collateral damage you might get with killing agents. I tend to be as selective as I can with the herbal agents that I use for killing anyway, and I think there is, if you have that as a goal in mind, you can choose to more carefully to limit the damage you're causing, which I don't think is done enough, to be frank. But I think also it's like you do use prebiotics and you do see levels of pathogenic bacteria go down and pathobionts go down. So you don't always have to go in there with that, I must kill this. It's like, let's actually just enrich the ecosystem and the good guys will deal with it. It's like, that's generally what occurs when we're talking about colonic ecosystem changes anyway. Small bowels are a little bit different, and I think are much more prone to using, antimicrobial agents for SIBO, for example, than colonic dysbiosis. Again, it depends on the ecosystem, but geez, I do a lot more work with prebiotics and dietary change in colonic dysbiosis, for example, and you see dramatic shifts in ecosystem composition.
Yeah, well, and I find just in our work with clients too, I sort of take, okay, what's the most conservative approach we can take, and we can always go more aggressive too. But I think clients want to start at the aggressive, like I want to just punch this, and it's like, no, let's just try something that's going to be naturally more ecosystem friendly as a whole. And again, we can always go more clearance based if we need to. But if you can lower methane producers with PHGG, or you can start, lowering some of these bad guys with something gentle, why wouldn't we start there? So yeah, it's always an interesting conversation with clients though, because it's still like, let's punch it, and it's like, I don't know, we might not need to punch it. Let's just do something gentle and supportive in the totality of the microbiome versus trying to be so aggressive. So again, I think that's such an important point, is you don't have to start out aggressive. You can start out kind of with these strategies that can still be pretty powerful, but they're going to be supportive of the microbiome as a whole.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, it's like you can't take away antibiotics. Like once you've administered an antibiotic or an antimicrobial, you can't take that away. So you might as well do something that's largely not going to harm the person or harm the ecosystem, and start gentle and then work your way in.
Right.
But I think people are really desperate and they want fast relief. I think that's why.
And that bit I totally get too, but it's also, for me, it's about informed consent to people being aware of the repercussions. Because I think when people are because antibiotics are often, I would say, overused in the functional medicine world, for indications that I would say are questionable from an evidence perspective. Where it's like, oh, let's try it. Let's try these antibiotic combinations, see if it makes a difference. But the patients aren't necessarily told that by doing that, there was a study published in Gut a couple of years ago that 9 species of bacteria went extinct from a single course of antibiotics administered into the arm. It wasn't even oral. 9 species from that, and it's like, okay, well, what? There is no return from that extinction, bar fecal transplants. There are more extreme ways of getting microbes back, but patients aren't necessarily told that. They're like, okay, we'll do this. It may work, may make a difference. You might lose 12 species of bacteria forever. We don't really know what that means yet. Maybe 15 species we'll lose, as well as cause sort of these major sort of disruptions. And it's not to say, we all know there's a time and place where antibiotics are immensely useful and save lives and save limbs, and there's no discussion about that. But it's the times where they're in between, where you've got choices. So, okay, we can use a prebiotic to modify the ecosystem. You can use herbs, or you can use an antibiotic, and again, there's different range within efficacy of degree of collateral damage within that field of antibiotics. But I think sometimes people in functional medicine, will grab the antibiotic path far too quickly. And I think it's all this idea that you can just reseed by eating some sauerkraut or or taking a probiotic supplement, a multi-strain probiotic supplement will permanently stay in your gut forever from that point. I think it's always been a bit of a ludicrous idea, because when you start looking at the composition of the ecosystem and the 150 or 200 different genera, if you're lucky, that are there, and you're like, okay, well, if you do kill off your anaerobic stipes or subdiluvial granule, these butyrate producing species, like you can't just shove some bifidobacteria in there and go, even if it did stay, it's like it doesn't do the same thing. It's like it's not functionally the same. And I think it's, even if you have 10 different types of bifidobacteria and 8 different types of lactobacilli, they can't replace these like butyrate producers, it's other sort of fiber, fermenters. Like, I think it's just never kind of made much sense, let alone the fact that they don't stick. We've got so much research showing that the bugs that we're getting from fermented foods or from probiotic supplements, the vast majority of them are just temporary visitors that persist for short durations of time.
Well, now this brings up another question, and this could be a hot topic within the field of functional medicine. You're just not using the right probiotics, Jason. You need spore-forming probiotics. Spore formers for everyone. They stick around in your gut forever, right? I mean, that's
we
kind
easily
of what's
evaluate that.
suggested.
Still testing pre and post and see that for yourself. I suggest you try that to see that.
Luckily, our viewers know that was dripping with sarcasm, so they know me well enough by this point. But seriously, like, the companies that make the spore-forming probiotics and the people who sell them online and write the blog posts and the YouTube videos, they make it sound like God's greatest gift to probiotics. And this is like the only thing you need. Nobody should ever take lactobacillus because it's useless, but the spore formers will really reseed the gut, and hooray, these are the best ever. And like, they could be helpful, but I don't think it's the be-all, end-all of all probiotics ever.
No, and the issue I've always had is how dismissive they are of all like lactobacilli or bifidobacteria-based probiotics just by default. And it's just, well, you can't ignore all this hundreds of clinical trials because it's inconvenient for you, going, oh, they don't survive transit to the stomach and small intestine, and therefore they don't work. And I'm like, well, when they often do, the strains are chosen because they do survive stomach and transit and bile salt exposure, etc. And 3, we've got clinical trials showing that they actually work. And I think if you're promoting a product that doesn't have clinical trials showing it works and saying it's superior to those that do have clinical trials showing it works, there's something wrong there. And I think that was certainly an issue in this. That spore sort of, when they first came out, there's a lot of hype without the research. That is changing, thankfully, and there's some companies that are putting money into research, which is fantastic, and I love to see. And that means we get to see what these things actually can do and potentially compare them to other bifidobacteria strains or lactobacillus strains. But I think this dismissing the entire area of lactobacilli bifidobacteria-based probiotics is just been nonsensical, and it's just I think it's a bad way of selling product.
Well. And it always just struck me as like, this is clearly just marketing to you.
Yeah.
Like, this isn't about the truth. It isn't about like what's clinically relevant or what's like documented in the research. It's just, if you fool enough people with these statements, you're going to sell a few more bottles of your product.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
and that's how it's always. It's
not a good way to conduct
we
business.
Should be doing this. No, it should be, okay, my product is superior. We've got clinical studies showing it works better at doing, or does something unique. Totally on board with that, but just saying ignore all this other research, it's rubbish. Pretend it doesn't exist and our products are better, even though there's no research saying it is. That's not good. Not good science.
They're silly billies. How about that? They're silly billies. What about? Can we talk about? Okay, so this is again my perception. You've been in this field longer than me. I feel like the hot topic, and maybe I got this idea from you initially in one of your courses. Like, the hot topic, the it girl boogeyman from like the 90s and early 2000s was Candida. Everybody had Candida. Everyone's talking about Candida. Everybody's doing a Candida cleanse. And now, like 2015 onward, now the it girl is more so SIBO. But do you want to, do you have any little nuggets of wisdom to share about Candida, other than feeding the good guys and changing the pH of the ecosystem is going to inhibit a lot of Candida for you?
Yeah, which is how I usually approach it, and try to use selectively acting antifungals when it's there. I mean, I do think we're kind of at a challenging point with looking at the fungal ecosystem, and I don't think we have any tests available to us as clinicians or the general public that tell us a comprehensive overview of what's there. This is the issue in that we know from research studies that the microbiome is complex, and there's a bunch of different fungal yeast species that are normal for us to have, and what levels are probably normal. And that's kind of only, I'd say, come out the last 5 years or 6 years, that kind of research. So it's very early yet, but it's not available to us. So for us, we can do a stool test where we culture and go, okay, can we grow this thing? But we know there's a bunch of stuff we won't be able to grow already. And I don't think anybody does a really good DNA-based assessment of what that fungal ecosystem looks like, so we can get a better idea of what's normal, what's abnormal, and how it responds to different treatments too. Like there's some interesting research, a bit of a tangent, but I can't help but think of this study done on fluconazole in rats. And they gave these rats these fluconazole, and some fungi went down, totally, but other fungi went up, and the net result was the same amount of overall fungi was there. It's just you had different fungi there. And the bacterial ecosystem changed too, because it turns out that different fungi were cross-feeding with different bacteria, and we just completely changed the fungal ecosystem, we completely changed the bacterial ecosystem. It's just like, gosh, that was not on anybody's radar before that kind of study was done. And I think we're so early into the piece yet that we're often have no idea, in my opinion, what we're actually working with the fungal ecosystem yet, because we don't have the right tools, and we're stuck using like urine markers to try to tell us what's going on from a fungal gut perspective. Yeah, just not ideal.
Yeah.
I was going to ask about the urine markers, because that's another one that I'm inherently quite skeptical of personally. Like, I have used it, I've played with it, but when I've used the one popular test in particular, I'll have to have, my assistant go back through the data, kind of like I did with the other test. I feel like my memory of it is that literally every single person is diagnosed with some sort of fungal overgrowth on that popular urine test. So
it does seem common for people to show positive on that test.
And I get their selection bias because I work with people with gut problems. So I know that more of my people would have fungal overgrowth as opposed to the general population, probably. But like close to 100% is just real fishy in my mind.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I know my brain kind of flags that too. And I think because we just don't have a great way, because it won't necessarily correlate with culturing. Or PCR tests won't show anything wrong. But it could still mean that there's some other fungi there. We just don't have the proper testing for. But it may mean it's not. It might mean that they ate some food that contained arabinose. That's showing up in their pee, because a lot of foods do. So I'm cautious around making big diagnostic decisions based on that.
And I wonder too a little bit about some of the urine tests too, because like I think I was telling Nikki this when I was younger. I had my eardrum burst, and I had a whole bunch of yeast in my ear. And again, like women have yeast infections. Again, like there's yeast other places in the body too. Like when you have
Sinuses.
when you have a urine test, like can you really isolate where the yeast is? It could still be a microbiome issue. It's just not necessarily the GI microbiome.
Good point.
But I always wondered a little bit about that. Like if someone just was really prone to vaginal yeast infections, like do they necessarily have a GI yeast issue? Maybe, again, but maybe not.
Great line of thought, actually. I'm wondering if that the test actually controlled for that with the healthy controls males, females, vaginal microbiota. It's very interesting.
I think I have seen some research that suggested, and I don't remember like how old it was or what the methods were, but I do think I've seen some data that suggested that like women with chronic vaginal yeast infections, I want to say it was like 80% of them also had some manner of fungal overgrowth in the gut. Right. And I don't remember what the numbers or like what the testing methodology was. But I feel like I remember seeing that at some point. I probably made a YouTube video and just forgot about it now on that topic. But I think that honestly, this could be said for blood and urine, right? Like if you do a test with blood or urine, you're kind of speculating on where that metabolite came from, right? So like, okay, when you measure C-reactive protein in blood, you know you have inflammation, but like, where's the inflammation?
Yeah.
You don't know based off of that test. Well, you kind of do, like CRP is made in liver, but you get the idea, like you could have that for any number of reasons. Yep. Or if you find fungal metabolites in your urine, it could be coming from your vagina, your sinuses, your funky weirdo ear. The things we talk about.
I
Also,
know.
side note, horrifying little nugget of wisdom from the ear, nose, throat area of practice. There's a thing called a fungal ball. It's literally just a ball of fungus lodged in your sinus. It's a real thing. Don't Google it. But that is a thing. And sometimes you have to get a fungal ball removed from your dang sinus, and it's about enough to make you want to hurl. I had a very
reckon it would
persistent
be-
sinus infection a couple years ago, and I was moderately convinced that it was a fungal ball, and I went to my ENT, and he was like, oh, yeah, I have a colleague in California who treats those all the time. But
my
this is not a
gosh.
fungal ball. No.
Okay. Yeah, and one would think that would produce some sort of fungal markers too in that case.
Right.
Because it's going in the blood, and then you're filtering your blood to create urine, and then you're peeing it out. So it's
Yeah.
all the same juice.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness gracious. Well, now could we actively doodle on something, like a real world application of some of this stuff for a moment? And I'm selfishly gonna ask you this because it's a question I have. So I started doing this fun little experiment on my YouTube channel where I basically doing like 3 or 4 16S tests and kind of taking like the average of those, and that's my baseline. Then doing 2 weeks of an intervention of
Oh, yeah.
some sort of prebiotic,
Yeah.
right? So like I did PHGG, glucomannan. I did 2FL, but I ended up trashing the data because my diet was different. I was on vacation around the same time.
Okay.
So I ended up trashing the data on that. But, and then after the 2 weeks of supplementation, I redo another like 3 or 4 16S stool tests. Again, take the average from
Okay.
all of those as
Yeah.
my like pre and post intervention data points.
Yeah.
What I noticed with the two that I've done, glucomannan and PHGG, the data at the 2 week, like after 2 weeks of taking that prebiotic, I'm still taking it, but it's at the end of the 2 week period.
Yep.
My Bifido did not go up at all, but 2 weeks later, at the end of the washout period, before I did the next intervention, my Bifido went crazy. Like I'm talking like less than 1% up to 9 and 15% respectively, which is absurd for me, especially because
Okay.
I've had crap loads of antibiotics in my life. So my Bifido are consistently low. But do you think that it took 2 weeks for my Bifido to like get the memo and really go up, or was there something else? I couldn't find anything else in my diet or like supplement routine. I couldn't find anything else about my life in that time period that would have explained it. The first time it happened with PHGG, I was like, I said this in the video, I was like, well, I had red wine like one night, 6 days prior, and like maybe the polyphenols really did something for the Bifido. I don't know.
Yeah.
And I just kind of shrugged it off as like, oh, this is weird and surprising. But then the same thing happened with, it was glucomannan was the first one. And then the same thing happened with PHGG, but even more exaggerated, it went up to 15%. And I was like, what the what?
Wow. I mean, that's a
Anyway.
big increase in with Bifido with
Huge.
PHGG. To be honest, I generally don't do follow up microbiome assessment less than 4 weeks. Yeah, and I think it probably takes, in my mind, and whether this is based, I've been doing this for years, whether it was based on clinical observation before, that 2 weeks was inadequate, and it took 4 weeks' time to see the sort of bigger shift from it. And again, sometimes after 8 weeks, you see another bigger shift move on from that point too. So I think there is a bit of delay, even though we've got those studies where you. I think the David study in 2014 where they took people on like an all meat diet, and yeah, even within like 48 hours, there's like a massive change around an ecosystem. So we need the ecosystem can change relatively rapidly at certain situations. But my experience with prebiotics is, as an add-on, is I'd usually give it 4 weeks to do its thing to see the impact.
Admittedly, with the experiment, I was impatient because I was like,
Fair
all right,
enough,
if
I
I
get
do
that.
this, like, okay, if I do it this way, then I could churn out one video a month and I could get this, like just go through it. But also, it was very weird / awful for my gut. Like my gut has been rock solid for years.
Yeah.
I have not had IBS in a lot of years. My gut was very perturbed doing that, where I was like 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. So that's also, I stopped the
Yeah.
experiment for right now, and I'm going to pick it up again in 2023. But I did decide, like, I'm going to have to do a full month with a little bit of a ramp up, and then a full month off with like a little bit of a ramp down. And I'm going to have to like elongate the experiment. So
Yeah.
I'm already getting impatient thinking I can only do 6 of these videos in 2023. Damn it. But it's,
Yeah,
it's
I love the
patient.
idea of it. I do, but I think you're right. 'Cause, I mean, even working with most people that we would work with in the gut, SIBO, IBS world, is that prebiotics. We'd never start at the therapeutic dose. It'd always be this like low dose and slowly build
I would
up.
give myself a day. You know,
Yeah.
like with the PHGG, I started off with 1 scoop per day for 1 day.
Yeah.
And then I just went right up to the 2 scoops a day. Come on, Jason.
Yeah, and I
gave
think for
myself
some
a
people it's
ramp
got
up.
to be totally fine with that. Like I still, recall working with people who don't have major gut issues but just want to make their immune system healthier. Geez, yeah, they could start with the therapeutic doses and they'll fart a bit more. Big deal.
Yeah, big
for
one.
most of us, it's not such a big deal. But for other people who are getting like pain, discomfort, bloating, distension, change in bowel pattern, it's like you've got to incrementally increase up, and then to get to that dose, it may well take, you're right, like 3 or 4 weeks to get to the actual therapeutic dose, and then you want to get that dose for about 4 weeks, and then sort of do a test to see what your system looks like. And your gut may not need that much of ramping up, but it's just reality with people that we work with is often it's slow and cautiously increasing the dose.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would never do that to a patient what I did to myself. But again, I was like,
No.
I'm totally fine. I'm good, man.
Yeah, no, I remember I did a workshop, and these people were just generally healthy people, for the most part, who wanted to get healthier ecosystems. And I was talking about prebiotics, and then he does lactulose and inulin phos and GOS at the standard dose all at once from
bigger
out of
girl?
the blue, never. And he said he was farting like a tremendous amount of farting, but his bifidobacteria went from 0.1 up to 30% of his ecosystem. I still recall that was one of the earliest high bifidos I'd seen. And he was like,
Damn.
yeah, but that's 4 weeks of doing 3 different prebiotics
Everything.
at the high dose. But he could handle that. His gut could handle that. His work life, he was outside carpenter, so letting off a lot of flatus was okay in that situation.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, I'll keep you posted on the 2023 version of the experiment.
I'll be
But
curious,
like I
yeah.
said, it's going to be slower for sure.
Yeah.
Got to be nicer to my gut.
Yeah. Do you have any tips in terms of like dietary fiber you like people to incorporate, or even the prebiotics that you typically use? Like, are there any tips that you have your clients do? I know you said the titration up, which we've
Yeah.
talked a lot about. It's
Yeah.
always hard because there is some adjustment period, and with the IBS space, there's always fear of like, ooh, you're telling me to take prebiotics? What? I've been low FODMAP for 3 years and you're telling me
Yeah.
to take a prebiotic? So I think it's always a good conversation because, you'll be working with someone who isn't getting any better, on these low fiber diets. And it's like, let's
Yeah.
try something new. But of course, your gut's going to be a little shocked having a prebiotic fiber in there if you haven't had much fiber in 3 years.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, do you have any general tips, like both from dietary sources and then just like prebiotics, ones that would be good starters that you like?
Yeah.
I'm sure every microbiome's different, but yeah.
Yeah, I do think that for like someone who had like IBS type signs and symptoms, and let's say that we ruled out SIBO and fructose intolerance and lactose intolerance, and a bunch of other things that might be causing those IBS like signs and symptoms. I think partially hydrolyzed guar would be my go-to, and I think I used it when I first came across it in 2015 or something like that. I was like, why have I never heard this before? And I sort of did a systematic review trying to pull all the research together about PHGG in IBS, and it's like all these, I think it's 8 positive studies that were done, and it's like, oh gosh, it's very consistent. And probably the first 30 people I used it on with IBS worked beautifully. No one had a side effect. It was like the dream prebiotic fiber. Then I had one person that got some bloating with it. I'm like, okay, well, it doesn't work. since it's not side effect free for everybody, but it
Right.
goes well with this population. Yeah, so I
Right.
still think that's probably my go-to, but also galacto-oligosaccharides is probably my second favorite sort of supplementary fiber in that population. But I also think it's like, okay, we have to look at, you've got transit time, you've got to look at whether it's slow or not, because if it's slow, there's a greater chance you're going to react to any
Right.
fiber, and certainly potentially PHTG, certainly more likely GOS, and look at the role of visceral hypersensitivity in that patient too. So if their gut's that inflamed that like tiny amounts of increased gas is going to cause excruciating pain and discomfort, which can be the case in some patients with IBS. I think I'd actually, before I necessarily did much with PHTG or dietary fibers from a diet perspective either, I would do work on the trying to decrease that visceral hypersensitivity. Yeah, and that work
And I
might
was
go for
just-
2 or 3 months before we go, all right, now let's introduce that quarter teaspoon of PHTG a day, and then half a teaspoon, and then 3/4 of a teaspoon, and slowly sort of build up. Because and other people, it's something with Tuli that you've got to kind of get going better, so that that gas that does get built up doesn't get stuck behind sort of all that fecal matter, and cause bloating and distension too. So you might do some work along that. And luckily, I mean, we know that things like partially hydrolyzed guar gum tends to speed up transit time in people who have slow transit time. We know we can use the right probiotic strains to help facilitate that too. Like the BioGaia strain, or the bifenthrin lactis HN019, we know and often speed up transit time quite effectively, so they can be useful tools to help facilitate better tolerance to prebiotic fibers as well.
Yeah. No, that's great.
And
And
that segues.
I just was going to highlight one thing that you said that I think is important. Sometimes focusing on that some of the functional breakdowns are super important. You can do them simultaneously, but if the microbiome's awry, but your motility is really poor, like you might want to focus on the motility first. Or again, if you're not breaking stuff down up top because you have low stomach acid, or you have low pancreatic enzymes or something like that, you probably want to focus on those things first, because they're going to affect what bugs grow and what bugs don't, and how you tolerate treatment and different strategies going forward. So I like that you point that out. I think that's a really important point for people to, when they're experimenting with some of this stuff. If it didn't work at first, maybe there was a motility issue. Maybe you can try it again once that's running a little smoother.
For sure. And I think the visceral hypersensitivity thing is often, we know it's very common in IBS patients.
Right.
And it can be extremely severe. Like, patients who can feel every little gas bubble. I've had patients who had to do an enema before bed to wash out the fecal matter so they could sleep, because the feces that remained in the colon and the rectum area was causing so much pain they couldn't go to sleep. That's more extreme end of just like that area was nerves were so inflamed in that area. But it just means that any sort of gas production is notable for
Right.
them. And it's like, I can look at the ecosystem as like, I remember having one patient, it was like 2% butyrate producing species. 2% was all there was. And lots of hydrogen sulfide gas producers, and it's like, we really need to change this for you to get better. But visceral hypersensitivity was so severe that we couldn't just go, eat more fiber, take this prebiotic. It's like, will that change the ecosystem? Yeah, it will, but it's going to cause excruciating pain and discomfort and horrific quality of life for a while, maybe for a long while. So it's like, no, we've got to do these little baby steps. Okay, now we need to do that before we can actually do too much. And some of those patients are really tricky when the ecosystem is that deranged, because that the ecosystem is causing the visceral hypersensitivity. So it's like, and so that can be really challenging patient to work with that subset that's that severe, and they've been on this person was just eating 2 chickens a day. That's it, nothing else. And it just
make the
weighed
dietitian
down over
cry.
years, and practitioners were like, let's cut out the potatoes, let's cut out this, and and all of a sudden then she's like, oh no, I got worse when I cut out the last remaining fibery foods than what there was before. And I'm like, yeah, I reckon you have, because your butyrate producers are almost all gone now, and your hydrogen sulfide producers are even higher, and hydrogen sulfide gas causes visceral hypersensitivity, so you're kind of stuck in this tricky situation. But sometimes you've got to do a lot of prep work before you can do major microbiota modification.
And you probably made Amy cry on the inside talking about the person eating like one food or two foods.
Right.
The dietitian's going to weep over here right
Well,
now, but
I think that what
Yeah.
the saddest thing though too, and we talk about this all the time, if practitioners are moving so many foods and, nutrition is important for gut function and for the, intestinal lining to be healthy. Like there's so
Yeah.
many reasons why you need optimal nutrition for gut to function, and just there seems to be no discussion of nutrition at all, like in the fundamental, like, oh, I need enough B12 or I need enough thiamine or I need enough of this. Like there's no nuanced discussion around that, which is very frustrating, I think, because it's just like, oh, just keep removing. Like you can survive off those 2 chickens, even though there's like, no vitamin C, no, like
Yeah.
you're super deficient in
Yeah.
all tons of different things. Like there's so many gaps. It's like, how do you overcome that?
well, and I would say maybe the problem is because we've hammered the snot out of this over the years and we'll continue to do so, but maybe the way to phrase it is that there's so much emphasis on nutrition for pathology
Right.
that there's no room for a discussion of like nutrition for healthy human beings. Right? So like the idea of like you need healthy optimal nutrition just to be like a healthy person and to heal your tissues and to function. Like there's no conversation of that in the functional space, even though they'll say from the rooftops food is medicine. But there's all this idea of like, well, you have to starve the one bad guy or the boogeyman. And they use food as medicine, but it's like you have to cut out oxalates. Now you have to cut out histamine. Now you have to cut out FODMAPs, cut out fiber, carbs, all of it. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Yeah.
Focusing on nutrition for pathology instead of nutrition for healthy human beings.
I hear you.
Yep. I was going to ask too. So going back to so you had mentioned visceral hypersensitivity and
Yep.
working on that first. And I'm glad you pointed out that hydrogen sulfide can cause visceral hypersensitivity. So like doing things to target those microbes could be helpful. Is there anything else that you want to say about visceral hypersensitivity or like things that you have found really helpful for people who struggle with that?
And this is where I think herbal medicines are fantastic because we do have some data, mostly animal data, but that's the best data we've kind of got on their capacity to
animals.
decrease visceral hypersensitivity. And it works in my experience with humans too, for that matter. But, the herbal combination iberogast, is commonly used in IBS circles because there's clinical studies showing it helps reduce IBS symptoms in the short term. And it does, for some people, it does reduce bloating and distension and cramping and pain. But for others, it doesn't have that impact. So sometimes they might try it for 2 weeks and go, it didn't work for me. Not knowing that with long-term use, it diminishes visceral hypersensitivity. So that's not after a week, that's not after 2 weeks, it's after 3 months of daily consistent use. I find a well-absorbed turmeric extract, I tend to use the curcumin phytosome Riva because it's really well absorbed and it clinically seems to work really well in concert with iberogast. And to me, that's my dream team for decreasing visceral hypersensitivity. Yeah, and there's some research on melatonin in this field too, but melatonin can potentially slow down gut transit time. So there might be, again, a time and place for it for people with really quick transit time. You'll go, melatonin might do both things here. Work on that and slow down that really rapid gut. For who's constipated, you might be a bit more cautious around melatonin usage.
I feel like I've seen stuff that suggests melatonin is a prokinetic though. Maybe-
Yes, but in a low dose. There's some
okay.
really funky animal studies where they're like, there's a direct dose-dependent response. That a low dose of melatonin is a prokinetic,
okay.
and a high dose, there's some human studies showing it slows down transit time.
Okay.
So I think it's, and I'm still experimenting trying to find what dose does what. To be honest, it's like, if I had some lovely scientific probes or something, we can do this really systematically, but I don't have that access. So we just have patients. Let's try this dose of melatonin and see if it works as a prokinetic. But it doesn't seem to slow things down anyway at a low dose, whether it's working as a prokinetic as I'd like. I'm not sure necessarily. But it does
Kind of
help with
almost
visceral
like-
hypersensitivity as well.
Kind of almost like low dose erythromycin or low dose naltrexone. Like the low doses of the medication do completely different things.
Yeah.
Like both of those are prokinetics versus being an antibiotic or I forget what naltrexone is used for normally. I think.
Yes, as do I actually. And there's also some research on peppermint and caraway combined to decreasing visceral hypersensitivity. And this is an interesting study because peppermint oil on its own didn't do this caraway oil on its own didn't do that, but when they combined the two together, there was synergy and it decreased visceral hypersensitivity. And I've used that successfully, even as a herbal tea of peppermint and caraway. For example, I remember I had one patient who had Clostridium difficile infection. She'd taken antibiotics to deal with that, which in this case was thankfully successful, but she had this lingering visceral hypersensitivity afterwards, and this persisted for months, and then she responded amazingly well because she was a tea drinker, so okay, well, let's just do this, and I just recall that she responded really, really well to that combination.
Interesting. Well, I feel like TCM practitioners have kind of understood herbal synergy for a really long time, and it's taking a while for the Western world to catch on to that idea. But the idea that herbs can be synergistic or like enhance the effectiveness of each other has been known for thousands of years, just not in the Western world, perhaps.
It's true enough, and Western herbalists certainly believe that too. Even if we tend to combine formulas more individually for patients, unlike TCM, where you've got these thousands of year old formulas that you might go, this formula match this pattern disharmony. And sometimes I've had I think hubris is the word of going, I reckon I can make that TCM formula better by changing this herb, which I don't think should be in there, and I'll replace it with something else, and the mix did not work. It's like, nah, I reckon those people formulating 2,000 years ago did a better job than me. I shouldn't question that. Yeah.
They did it their way for a reason.
Yeah, or maybe been over generations of clinical observation going, no, this combination is ideal in this situation.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think to share too, like, look, you brought something to the table. I'll share this for what it's worth. A couple of other things, maybe for visceral hypersensitivity. Well, one I learned from you. There's the probiotic. What is the strain? The 299V lactobacillus.
Yes.
Was it plantarum? I think that's been shown to reduce visceral hypersensitivity too. I'm pretty sure I got that from your stuff. Look, I've schooled the teacher on his own material. Who knew? I told you, you've been a science crush for a long time. But also, I wonder, I've played a little bit with like vagus nerve stim here or there, like putting an ear clip on the tragus of the ear and doing that sort of stuff. I had one patient who thought that a device called the Alpha Stim was really helpful. And it was a similar idea. Like he had C. diff, teenage kid, 17-year-old kid. He had been on doxycycline for 3 years for acne, because why the fuck not? Yeah. And then he had to take an antibiotic for like a sinus infection, and bam, C. diff at 17 or 16. They had gotten rid of the C. diff, but he had lingering visceral hypersensitivity and just a lot of pain. And it was actually, I can't even take credit for this. I didn't really know about this, but his acupuncturist recommended the Alpha Stim to him. And he thought it was really tremendously helpful. I've been kind of playing with it. I got one myself to kind of fiddle with it a bit. But yeah, at least I have a couple of people who have since tried the Alpha Stim and thought that that was helpful.
Interesting.
And then, like I said, the like vagus nerve stim with the ear clip on the left tragus and doing that seems to have helped too. And then right now I've got a couple of people experimenting with castor oil on the abdomen and then leaving it on maybe with some heat.
Okay.
And then seeing how that works. Some people have said that it's helpful. Some people have been like, But I figure a lot of women use castor oil for period cramps.
Yeah.
And
interesting.
Like, it felt like vaguely related enough that it's like, just slather it on your belly instead of down near your pelvis. Same diff. Crampy, irritated muscles and nerves, right? Like it's kind of the same thing in a different location. So
cool. Well, it's nice hearing that there's more tools that I'm not familiar with, and butyrate. I think butyrate helps too. It's just that sometimes you can't feed those butyrate producing bacteria that well in those people that have extreme visceral hypersensitivity, and that's where the few instances where I will use preformed butyrate, whereas most people I prefer nurturing their own butyrate producing factories because they're there. Let's feed them and get a lot more butyrate being produced that way than what we're generally getting in some little form. But in those people who have extreme levels and can't tolerate any increase in fibrous material because of gas bubble causing extreme pain, then I think butyrate preformed is immensely helpful.
Have you ever used butyrate in an enema with patients?
Yeah, I have.
And could you just like break open the capsules and put that in the enema solution and use that?
Yep.
I mean, I have suggested this to several patients, but 0 of them have taken me up on the offer because enemas just, they're not as glamorous as the orally administered supplements.
They're
and herbs,
not.
I guess.
I tend to reserve like what I call retention enemas for. Listen, sometimes with extreme rectal visceral hypersensitivity, I've used them, and more often for ulcerative colitis as well, where that particular lower part of their colon is and rectum area is really inflamed, and because essentially things we're taking orally, curcumin, et cetera, is going to be more diluted by the time it gets down to that last bit of the colon. So I do think, and I've had some people where it's been immensely helpful, and I think the trick there is having a small volume. At least that's been my experience. Is like with a retention enema, you don't want like a big bloody enema kit. You want like 20 mils, like a tablespoon's worth of material that you put in there at night, and then it can sit in there all night and then come out the next morning. So I might use a combination of Reviva curcumin and aloe vera juice, for example, and maybe some PHDG in that. That will be individual a bit per person, but I do find those retention enemas can be really helpful for visceral hypersensitivity and inflammation in that area.
Well, yeah, that's a valid point. Like if you get one of these big honkin' enemas. Side note, weirdest series I ever did for my YouTube channel was the coffee enema series because I did them for a few days. Because like I can't talk about them if I've never done them, right?
Yeah.
So weirdest experience probably of my life was when I did coffee enemas for like a week so I could do that YouTube series. It was bizarre. But what was I saying with that? I got sidetracked by my own little story.
Maybe it's the volume of enema.
Yeah, the volume. It was like, I don't even know. It was like quarts of water. It was a lot of liquid. That's all I'll say.
And that's what you don't want to do with someone who's got rectal hypersensitivity, rectal inflammation in that area, or visceral hypersensitivity. Put a huge volume of something in there to stress out those stretch sensors. You don't want that. You just want a small volume that can stay in there. So the principle is different, and you have to use one of those little like rectal bulbs rather than because I've got an enema kit too. It's this huge, fits like a couple liters of water.
It's a bucket.
Like you can't do a small volume in that either. It's just not
Yeah.
a useful tool for that.
Yeah. I'm kind of picturing one of those like nose Frida squishy balls,
Yeah.
where almost
right.
like something like that. I would imagine would be more appropriate here.
Totally.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Amy
I
missed the
disappeared for a
conversation
minute.
about the nose Frida.
Oh yeah, I missed it. Sorry, my computer was about to die, so I was like, I gotta plug it in. I think
That would have been bad.
yeah, my husband, I think he unplugged my computer blast, and so I had to sneak off and plug it back in.
He's trying to
You
sabotage
didn't
us.
sneak off that well because we all saw.
I know,
it.
I know,
As it turns
I know. I
out.
was stumbling over there. The little low energy thing popped up, and I was like, oh gosh,
Well, you did it. We're proud of you.
thank you.
And you're still here.
I know.
I forget honestly where we were before I got on my tangent about coffee enemas. Oh, I think visceral hypersensitivity. Do you have anything that you want to weigh in on for that matter, Amy? Again, try to be mindful to give you a turn so I don't just
Yeah, no,
ratchet you off.
this has all been really interesting just to hear kind of some different things that could help there. I know that there's like some research, and again, like this would be like not the first go-to. Like I'd much rather try some of the stuff that you guys are suggesting. But like low FODMAP, I think, has been shown to help a little bit with visceral hypersensitivity too. But again, would not be my first choice. If you were kind of trying to manipulate the diet, and again, your best bet is trying to figure out if there's foods that might trigger it more so than others, and working on the mechanisms that might be breaking down that are causing some of the visceral sensitivity would be way more effective, in my opinion. Again, taking some butyrate to support your microbiome if you're not producing butyrate would be a much better option than probably starving butyrate producers even more with a low FODMAP diet. But like if you were in a pinch and wanted to do something for a week or two, it's something you could potentially do. But again, not the other things that you mentioned are much, I think, better and more productive for the ecosystem and the gut as a whole. But yeah.
Well, and even if you want to experiment with like low FODMAP, like you said, you could do like a modified version of it.
Right.
Right. So you don't have to do the full diet. You could just experiment with, I'm going to not eat beans, wheat, garlic, and onion for like a week or two and just see what happens.
Yeah.
You know, take out the biggest offenders and just
Right.
kind of play it by ear.
Such a
You
good
don't have to
point.
cut out all the things.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I
might be good
think
enough.
it's interesting looking at that, even the pre-low FODMAP diet stuff. I remember teaching about treating IBS pre-low FODMAP. And
Yeah.
they were still knowing that legumes and onions and garlic and stuff cause problems and increase gas. It just was like the codification that happened with Dr. Sue Shepard that was great in the name and the research that was sort of done on that sort of system. But the idea is that people aren't necessarily going to react to all those things, you know, like
Right.
every single one of those categories. But you cut them all out, you'd see the benefit, then you kind of introduce them back in. And that was certainly my take when I spoke to Dr. Shepard, was more about short-term diet. Let's bring things back in as quickly as we can. But it doesn't often manifest that way
Right.
in
Right.
clinical practice, where people are on these diets for
Not in the
for
functional
years and
medicine
not
space.
necessarily treating the underlying issue. I mean, I think that's the thing, because for me, it's like, it is a diet that reduces symptoms immensely well. You know, no doubt, no argument there.
Right.
But we know it causes detrimental shifts to the ecosystem, and I would argue that for most people, it doesn't fix the underlying
Right.
visceral hypersensitivity issue. You know, because I've had patients that have been low FODMAP for years, and their symptoms are manageable while they're on it, but they go back to eating something and the symptoms come back. It's 3 years on. It's like, and that's not what we want. Ideally, we want, like, let's see if we can sort this so that you don't have this visceral hypersensitivity, and then you can eat these foods again and not have to be on such a restricted diet. And I think for most people, we can get there. You know, there's some people that are obviously exceptions and more challenging treatment paths, but I'd say for most people with IBS, we can get there by doing, I think, appropriate testing to work at what's going on, and appropriate individualized treatment to address what their issues are. Because for me, IBS is just I always tell my students an umbrella term. It just means you got these symptoms, but it's like your job as a clinician is to work out why this person has those symptoms, what their contributing factors are. You know, for some people it will be SIBO, but not everybody. Some people will be visceral hypersensitivity, but not everybody. Some people stress will be the main driver, but not every. Like a patient I had yesterday was like pooed consistently daily, except for when she got highly stressed, and then bowel stop, and then bloating distension occurred. It's like, okay, but not everyone gets that impact on that, but it's okay. Well, stress is obviously one of the axes that we have to leverage in this particular therapeutic relationship to get certain things moving better. In transit time, high methane, you know, a bunch of stuff that we'd have to kind of look at for this IBS patient. People come with that label of IBS to work out what factors are their triggers or their causes, essentially, you know, and then how can we best address that for that person.
I feel like patients would almost be better served if we just dropped the S altogether. Like if we said, you have an irritable bowel, instead of you have, like, saying you have IBS, like you have a cat or you have this. It's like we're using this label and kind of handing this thing to them, and then they're like, oh, this is my precious and this is my answer, and it doesn't really tell you anything. But again, if we could tell people your bowels are irritable, now let's find out why. That kind of phrasing, I think, opens the door more for like the workup and the conversation and the curiosity of like, no, what led me down this path and why am I here and what are my triggers and what aren't my triggers.
Yeah, no, I think I like that, actually, because I think we tend to get a bit attached to that. It's okay, I find out what's wrong. It's like, no, you have a certain symptom cluster that meets our current definition of what we call IBS by the Rome 4, but it's like, why have you got those symptoms might be quite different than someone else who meets the Rome 4 criteria. You know, and if you haven't been worked up, like the number of people who actually, in my opinion, have IBS when I've actually diagnostically worked them up properly is really small. You know, if we actually do a proper workup, we work out there's generally something there, and that's not just. Yeah, and there are people who would have classic IBS, but I'd say it's actually a relatively small proportion when people are appropriately worked up.
Yeah. I'll throw this out there too. I think it's applicable for IBS in general, and certainly for SIBO and visceral hypersensitivity. Like a lot of the stuff that goes hangwire with these conditions, you can kind of trace it back a few steps to the nervous system on some level, right? So like the gut-brain axis and the vagus nerve and the enteric nervous system, like those nerves stimulate the muscles in the gut to contract, and then that's what we end up calling like motility or peristalsis or the MMC or stomach emptying, Like it's muscles contracting, and muscles contract because a nerve told them to contract. So we're kind of looking at a neurological pathway. Or like with visceral hypersensitivity, we have nerves that are really hypersensitive to any stimuli or any stretch sensation, and they're freaking out for reasons that they probably shouldn't freak out about. And like even things like low stomach acid, like the stomach doesn't make acid for funsies. It makes stomach acid because the nervous system and the gut-brain axis told it to. You close and open sphincters because your nervous system told them to close and open. So I almost feel like, too, a lot of the IBS and SIBO kind of space could benefit from tracing back and thinking, okay, what does the nervous system need to be happy and healthy? Right? Like adequate fuel delivery, adequate oxygen delivery. Like if you're iron deficient or anemic or B12 deficient, good luck, because nerves like oxygen a lot. Like you need enough building blocks to make neurotransmitters. If you don't have like, you know, the tryptophan or the vitamin B6 or the whatever, or the choline to make your neurotransmitters, like neurons don't work for free. They kind of need all that stuff to make all their juice and do their things. So I feel like we could kind of trace things back and think about it as nervous system related in a lot of cases. So that might be one of several missing links in this world.
I like that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I do too. Oh my goodness gracious. Well, I want to be mindful of your time so that we don't hog your day. I know it's the end of the day for us and the beginning of the day for you.
Beginning for me, yes.
Yes. I'm curious, just because I'm Snoopy. Have you been up to anything fun or cool recently, or do you have any like recent projects or upcoming projects or revelations or anything like? Can we get an IBS Freedom Podcast exclusive from Jason Hawryluk? Is basically what I'm asking.
This year has been like, I feel like I've barely left between working with patients and working with doing research stuff. I don't think I feel like I've left my eyes above the parapet, so to speak, to do anything too creative. One thing, a paper was just published yesterday on that the research team I was working with did that was looking at antibiotic usage and instances of depression. So we're doing a systematic review, looking at essentially does taking course of antibiotic increase your risk of getting depression? And to date, every single study has showed that it does. Yeah, and that's obviously the gut microbiota brain microbiota link. So that was kind of exciting to finally get that one published. It's always nice to get something published. So that's kind of new, and I am working on new course content because for us we're coming up to the summer break, which I know it's not for you guys, it's like depths of winter, but it's a time where my marking load and teaching load decrease, so I have a chance of like going, not just doing paperwork and marking. I can actually look up and go, what new can be created, what gap needs to be filled, what information needs to get out there. So I'm looking forward to having some time to do that.
Well, and hopefully you're doing a lot of self-care and just taking care of yourself too, because you can't teach us fans anything if you burn your adrenals to a crisp and burn yourself out into nothing. So like take some vacation also. Don't feel pressured to do stuff for our sake. Like just take care of yourself also. And I'm definitely going to look up that study. That's wicked fun. And
we always
horrifying.
have to like be very circumspect with our conclusions. So just keep that in mind for us to get it published. It's like you can't say that it does something. It's like you have to say it looks as though it might do this, even though every single study says this. We can't actually say it is a connection. It's like there may be a connection. More research is needed. So go deeper than that, because that's probably what the abstract will say. But it's actually look at the studies. Every study shows that there's a connection there, and sometimes lasting for 10 years after course of antibiotics, your risk of depression was actually increased. And that PhD student that I'm working with now, we're doing a study looking at antibiotic use during pregnancy, like during labor, for example, and seeing if it leads to increased risk of prenatal depression as well. So that's exciting, and we're kind of just got to the end of enrollment with that one, so we'll probably get the data over the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah.
Cool.
Very cool. See, and look, this is why maybe I was a researcher in another lifetime, but not this one. I think I just need to stick with YouTube research. It's like, I don't know if I saw that compelling evidence. I don't know if I could put in the abstract anything other than this clearly causes depression, guys. So like, I give you credit for doing like what you needed to do to get it published and not using overly strong language, because I don't know if I have the restraint to do that. But
It's a tricky
I do
thing
too.
with academia, actually. Like, you're never allowed to say anything strongly, And I think there can be benefits to that, but I think also in a situation, I remember my first ever systematic review was looking at lactose rhamnosus GG doesn't prevent antibiotic-associated diarrhea. All right. Every single study said it did. And my original write-up was like, here's the low-cost thing we can do to prevent this side effect. In many countries, that's available with the yogurt. You can just eat the yogurt while eating the antibiotics and look at the better outcomes we'll get. And the peer reviewer's like, no, you can't say that. Even if every study says it, you can't recommend they actually do it. Or let's say it's something positive. It's just like, whoa, that was my first like major taste into the peer review process. Was that you have to calm everything down and go that it looks like it might work, and you might think about taking this alongside that maybe, but do a lot more research first before you do anything. It's just like, yeah, it's and all.
I'm
academics are
feeling
kind of
ragey
circumspect about that.
listening to this. And I'm not like a naturally ragey person, but I'm feeling like my blood pressure go up hearing that. I would need to take up kickboxing or something and just like punch stuff after dealing with something like that. That's frustrating.
Yeah.
Because people want it in plain language. Like, what should I do? Is this, oh, and I saw a kitty, or no, a dog?
A dog,
I think.
yeah.
I got excited. I love both, so had to make mention of that. The people on the audio version of this podcast are like, "What? What?"
No, they want to see my little Cavalier King Charles wander
Aw.
through the frame. She's quite lovely. Yeah.
Cute.
Well, I appreciate the cameo. I'm sure Amy does too.
Truly. Love dogs. Yes.
Well, Amy, my darling, do you have any further questions for our guest of honor?
No, I think this has been great. I've loved every second of it. Yeah.
Every moment.
Every
It's
moment.
been good. It's been
Yes.
Yeah.
good. Yeah.
We'll keep an eye on your stuff.
I know, can't wait.
You could find the man himself on Facebook, kind of. He does have a probiotic advisor page. We were laughing about this earlier. He does have a Facebook page for Probiotic Advisor, and he occasionally will post stuff. Actually,
when I'm
okay,
not
can I?
seeing
I know we're
patients.
wrapping up.
Yeah.
I know we're wrapping up for the most part, but can I just weigh in on one more thing or comment on one more thing? Do you want to comment at all on the study with the SIBO breath testing and the mouthwash? Because I found that on your Facebook page when you
Yeah.
posted it there. So kind of fill people in if they don't know about that study, and then
Well,
comment a teeny
I'm
bit.
slightly probably rusty on some of the details of it myself, but the biggest takeaway
Unacceptable.
was is that it's one of my PhD students is actually delving into this. It's a great amount of research that's coming out of here, but it's like doing a mouth rinse actually changes the breath test results. Yeah, so different labs will some recommend doing a mouth rinse and some don't. But if you do a mouth rinse, you can get we're getting all these false positives results if you do a mouth rince before the first breath test only. And then maybe that's probably the biggest takeaway. There's a bit more in that paper, but geez, it's just like, okay, so if you do a mouth rinse before baseline, you're even if you have like we had all these, had these major jump ups at the 20-minute mark, enough to be positive, who would not have been positive if we didn't do the mouth rinse beforehand. Yeah.
And that makes sense because, right, like the way that the tests are usually interpreted is a difference in the gases from baseline. So
Yeah.
again, if you artificially tank your baseline and then you have, the next couple of samples go up, it is going to give the illusion of a peak when there really wasn't a peak necessarily
Yeah.
that early on in the test. But what I actually found even more fascinating maybe is that the study was beautifully designed too, but I thought it was cool that you had some data where people only did the mouth rinse for the first one, and then you compared like whether they did that or not, and they got a bunch more false positives with that.
Yep.
But then there was also the difference between people who did an antimicrobial mouth rinse before every single sample versus people who did not, or versus the same people, I think, who did not. And even that, like, you got far fewer SIBO diagnoses.
Sorry, she came up for a cuddle. So.
Hello.
Oh.
But you got far fewer SIBO diagnoses when the people used a mouthwash consistently before every single sample. And it makes you wonder, is some of the stuff that we're diagnosing as SIBO actually funky dysbiosis in the mouth,
Yeah.
and it has nothing to do with the small bowel.
Yeah, it did bring up some of those questions, and we delved into it, and there are methane-producing bacteria in the oral cavity, too. So it's like, oh, yeah, it does bring up some questions around breath testing reliability and pre-breath testing procedures and what might impact results. And we, part of Sharon, whose PhD is in, we're delving a bit more into that with further studies that have not been published yet, but looking at, okay, what's the impact of water rinsing and other things? We don't really know, because
Yeah.
it's like, does it have an impact or not? And we're trying to tease out some of those things
Yeah.
now to hopefully improve kind of the process that will go on with breast testing, so we do get more accurate results and have less chances of false positives, essentially,
Yeah.
or false
Yeah,
negatives.
because we don't need people getting false positives and then obliterating their microbiome with antimicrobials out the wazoo and doing
No.
low FODMAP for the rest of their days
Exactly.
because they think they have SIBO and they actually don't.
Yeah, no, I concur. I think false positives have a lot of negative outcomes associated with them, potentially. Obviously it depends on what path they choose, but generally it'll be something that damages their microbiota as a component of that treatment that they don't need. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm glad I remembered to make mention of that study because I thought that was, again, just beautifully designed. Kudos to the team, and also just deeply, deeply fascinating. You're asking really good questions. So
Yeah,
That's
we'll
why
keep
you've
your
been a
eye
science
open
crush.
on more research from that comes out of Sharon's PhD, because we're kind of delving into doing work with people with fibromyalgia. We've done like glucose, fructose, and lactose breath testing, and different sort of pre-breath testing procedures, looking at microbiota composition in people with fibro. So it'll be interesting findings when it all comes together.
yeah.
Cool.
Very good. Well, keep up the good fight. And don't forget to share findings like this on your Facebook page, because some of us old timers still use Facebook. And
Yeah.
you're one of the few people I follow on Facebook. So that's how I got the news on that last article. So,
Thank you. Well, I might post something with that systematic review article with the antibiotics too.
hey, there you go.
matter.
There you go. Look. Yep. Keep it going. But yeah, guys, so like I said, you can find the man himself on Facebook. The page is called The Probiotic Advisor, and the website, probioticadvisor.com. His courses are awesome, very reasonably priced, I might add also. And the probiotic database tool is just so good and very reasonably priced too. Like, it's totally worth having that. And yeah, just thank you so much for coming on. It was a blast. And hopefully we'll see you on the internet real soon. And otherwise, you guys know my shtick. If you're on YouTube, do the like, subscribe, comment, etc. And if you're on a podcasting app, leave us a 5-star review if you feel so inclined. But we will see you right back here for the next episode of the IBS Freedom Podcast. Toodaloo.
See you, everybody.